Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for ADAA's professional webinar, CBT for Regret. We're so delighted to have everyone join us here live today and saying hello to all of our recorded viewers who are watching this later. Please note this webinar is being recorded. If you did submit for CEs, you have received the information prior to this webinar and you'll receive it again following the session. We are doing live questions, so you can submit your questions at any time via the Q&A feature, and those will be answered at the end of the session. I would like to introduce our presenter, Dr. Leahy, who was educated at Yale and is the founder and director of the American Institute for Cognitive Therapy in New York City, the clinical professor of psychology and psychiatry at Weill Cornell Medical College, and past president of ABCT, the Academy of Cognitive Therapy, and the International Association of Cognitive Therapy. He is a well-published author with 29 books and a frequent keynote speaker. Thank you so much for being here with us today. I'm just going to hand it right off to you so we can get today started.
Well, thank you, Sasha, and welcome to everybody who's here and who will be arriving shortly. I'm here in New York City and it's raining in the background. So I'm going to share my screen and I hope you see it. So let's go back here. So I've been interested in a whole range of emotions, as some of you know. I've written books on jealousy and articles on envy, and I have an approach I call emotional schema therapy that I tie in with regret. And a lot of us will have unpleasant emotions in our lives. The goal in life is not the absence of emotion, it's the having a meaningful life. So what I'm going to argue today is that regret can be productive and it can be unproductive depending on how you use it and how you think about it. So just to notify you that I don't have any conflicts of interest, I don't have any grant money or investments. A lot of the work that I described today and a lot more on regret is described in my latest book, If Only: Finding Freedom from Regret. And I found out yesterday that we have 10 translations in the works. So it'll be widely available worldwide in various languages. So there are two kinds of regret. We can anticipate regret. Will I regret this in the future? Like, will I regret if I invest this money in the future, or will I regret that I don't? And one reason why regret is important in terms of anticipation of the consequences of decisions is that it can be viewed as an added cost. So when we think about the pros and cons of doing something, for people who are prone to regret, like people who are depressed or anxious, they seem to add on the cost of the regret. They think that if I do this, I'll be flooded with regret and self-incrimination and rumination and sense of hopelessness and defeat. There's also retrospective regret, which I think is what we usually mean when we talk about regret, like, oh, I made that mistake in the past, or I married the wrong person, or I didn't marry the right person, or I invested money and lost, or whatever. And so retrospective regret is that I make the wrong decision. And regret is then experienced as rumination about what I did and how my life could be better, self-criticism, remorse, guilt, and so forth. And I'll talk about both of these kinds of regret today and how we can think about them in ways that might be more adaptive. We have to keep in mind, if I make a decision to change or not to change, I could regret it. The Danish existential writer Kierkegaard said, if you marry, you'll regret it. If you don't marry, you'll regret it. So I want you to think about 3 regrets that you've struggled with or currently struggling with. Could be something about relationships or work or things that you've said or done or did not do. I'd like you to think about that, or if you can't think about your own, think about one of your clients, and then the thoughts that you might have about this. And, the thoughts like, self-critical thoughts, or my life could be better, or, I should have known, whatever it would be. And then the emotions that you have, like sadness, helplessness, feeling defeated, whatever they are, anger, perhaps. So I'd like you to think about how you might apply this to your own life. The one way of thinking about regret is to think about if you were to teach somebody to be like a world-class regretful person, like an Olympic neurotic. So here, you've heard of the 7 habits of highly successful people. Well, here are the 8 habits of highly regretful people. And think about if this fits any of your experience. Look back on your life and think of how much better off you would have been if you had done something else. Just think about how it could be so much better, maybe even ideal. Then dwell on all the negatives that you've experienced and discount all the positives. So whatever you have, just erase that. That doesn't count. And just dwell on the negatives. Idealize the choices that you did not make. So if you had married somebody else, absolutely perfect partner, everything would be great. Or if you had pursued a different career, you'd be happy all the time. And then insist that you should have known better. Oh, I should have known that this relationship or this career or this geographic location or whatever, or this investment, I should have known better. I should have known everything. And then criticize yourself for not having known better. It's one thing to think you should have known, but let's really add on criticism, like how stupid you are and what a bad decision maker you are and how little you know and how poor your decisions will be in the future. Then measure your choices, the outcomes of your choices, by the best outcome that you can imagine. So if you think about your partner, think about the best partner that you can imagine, someone with whom you have no differences and no disagreement. The same with a career, the same with place you live or your friends or whatever. Never accept trade-offs. Never think, well, there are pros and cons about everything. No, you're not going to accept that. You want maximized outcomes. You want the very best. You don't want to settle for less. So don't accept any trade-offs. And then when considering a choice, insist that you need to know everything for sure before deciding. So put off deciding until you have absolute certainty. So I want you to think if any of this applies to you or your clients, and if it does, is this helping you? Now, as I said before, we can have 2 kinds of regret. You can look backwards and think about retrospective regret, something I did or did not do. Like I did pursue this career or I did not pursue this other career. So this is a retrospective regret. And then the other kind of regret that I've referred to is what we call prospective regret or anticipatory regret, which is the forward-looking regret, anticipating that a course of action or inaction will lead to future regret. So, for example, a young man who had been living with his partner for several years was anticipating that if he got married, that he might regret it because somebody else might come along, might be better. But then he also thought, if I don't marry her, I could also regret that because she might be the best option that I'll ever get. So, so you can have retrospective regret and prospective regret, and we'll talk about the research on that and how to cope with it. I want you to think about any decision we make is about the future me. And we can go into this in a great deal of detail, but right now, let's keep that in mind that I'm making a decision about future utility. Am I going to be better off in the future if I do this? We don't want to get overcommitted to our past decisions. We want to make a decision about the future. So regret is the second most common mentioned emotion. The first being love, which is interesting because, if you think about the CBT literature, there's not a lot about regret, which actually motivated me to write the book, If Only, Finding Freedom from Regret. It's the second most commonly mentioned emotion, but we really don't have much in the CBT literature about it. There's a lot of work in decision theory and cognitive science and behavioral economics on regret. But this is a great opportunity for us to expand this area of life because it's such an important emotion. And it's a potential part of any decision. Whether I make a decision to make a change or not make a change, I can regret either decision. Some people say, I can't make a decision. They've already made a decision. In the long term, people regret things they did not do. In other words, they regret, I did not take that career. I did not marry that person. I did not move to that place. I did not make that investment. So in the long term, we have this regret for things we did not do. And it's possibly because when we think about what we did not do, we come up with a fantasy about what our life would be in this idealized fantasy world. The reality is that nothing in real life can ever compare to what you can fantasize. It's certainly something when you think about people who get involved with people who are married to other people, they often think, oh, my life would be wonderful if we were together. But that's not very likely to be the case in real life, because real life is about trade-offs. It's about pros and cons. And we find this similarity in regretting actions not taken in the long run in all the cultures that have been studied. So it's not just something that's unique to American or North American people. There are cultural differences in regret in Asian cultures, like in Japan and Taiwan. In Asian cultures, there's more regret about interpersonal situations, about relationships, and about family, because it's a more collectivist or communal society. American society is more individualistic, and so Americans are more regretful about decisions about their career or about their romance. It's about my experience, not about our experience. And we can even look at the issues, the levels of regret for people pursuing different majors in college. So you can see that the people in the humanities and arts and social and behavioral sciences are far more likely to regret having majored in that, versus at the bottom of this, people in engineering or computer information sciences and math. So the STEM, science, technology, and math, engineering and math, those people have much less regret about the majors that they chose than people in the humanities and arts and so forth. And I think a lot of this is related to the expected income that they will achieve once they graduated. In a national survey done a number of years ago, most common regrets in Americans were romance, family, education, career, in that order. And women were more likely to regret romance more than men. So you can see that the individual, I regret my romance and my family decisions and my education. This is the graph that illustrates, you can see that 18% of the regrets of the typical American were about romance and about 16% about family and education. So there, different surveys find different results, but you can see that there's a lot of regret. Interestingly, the prevalence of regret for gender affirming surgery is extremely low, less than 1%. So this is contrary to how some people might view transitioning, that the levels of regret are very low. In fact, there was a study done that was sponsored by the Washington Post that was published recently that showed that people who have transitioned are a lot more happy, more satisfied, and apparently less regretful than some people might anticipate. And the same thing is true with people who disclose their HIV status. There's a lot of anticipation that if I disclose my status, I'll be shamed, I'll be marginalized, which might happen, but the level of regret is only 4.6%. So this is sort of also part of, I think, something we should keep in mind, that we tend to predict a lot more regret than we actually experience in reality. Like one study by Gilbert at Harvard found that people were anticipated about 3 times as much regret as they actually experience. So we tend to anticipate more regret as we do more negative emotions than we actually experience. And one way of thinking about using regret from an existential point of view is, imagine that you're dying and you're looking back on your life. The question is, what do you think you're going to regret doing or not doing? Think about how hard people work and how much time they spend and work, and so much time trying to climb the achievement ladder or try to acquire possessions or status, or how much time you spend on the internet and how much time you spend on social media. So what do you think about, what do people who actually are facing death? So this was a study done on hospice patients facing death. And here are the most common regrets that were mentioned. It's not like I wish I'd spent more time on the internet or I acquired more money. I wished I had the courage to live a life true to myself, not the life others expected of me. So think about that, true to myself, not the life others expected of me. I wish I had not worked so hard. So think about that as well. This is the kind of the lack of balance in life that a lot of people find out too late. I wish I had the courage to express my feelings. So are you really going to regret telling somebody you love that you love them? Are you going to regret showing kindness or regret expressing your disappointment or frustration? I wish I had stayed in touch with my friends, and how easy it is after college to fall out of touch with friends, to lose touch and lose your friends. I wish I had allowed myself to be happier. Think about happiness as a goal in life and what can make you happy. Are you too busy to be happy? Are you too busy to spend time with your partner and with your children, or to engage in kinds of experiences that will really make you feel good? So these are the kinds of regrets that people facing death actually express. But we talk about regretting action to change or not change. when we take the short term, we experience what's called hot regret. So you often see this with buyer's remorse. Somebody buys a house or an apartment uh, or something, or a stock, and very soon after they have buyer's remorse. Oh my God, that's a stupid decision. I'm really going to regret that. So we have this kind of, just bear with me while I move this taskbar. We have this sort of immediate hot regret, but in the long term, as I said, we have more regret for actions not taken. In the short term, with actions not taken, like, oh, okay, I didn't buy that car, or that apartment, or that stock. In the short term, when we don't take an action, when we don't make a change, we have less intense regret. And it's more like wistful regret. Oh yeah, I regret it, but not that bad. But in the long term, our regret begins to build, not so much at that hot regret in the short term, but a longer term regret about, gee, my life could have been a lot better if I had made that change 5 or 10 years ago. So where does this regret come from? In my view, all of the emotions we have evolved because they were adaptive. And we think about adaptive, they increase the probability of passing on our genes, which means that they protect us from being killed. They increase the probability of procreation and the survival of offspring. So the human capacity for what's called counterfactual thinking, about thinking what could be or might have been, that's something that we don't see in animals. For example, I observed that a cat, and I love cats, but my cat has 4 cognitions and none of them are associated with regret or worry. And the 4 cat cognitions are, this feels good, this doesn't feel good, I want that, and what's next. None of that is going to be leading to worry or to regret. So we have this capacity. So why did this evolve? Why did the smartest living organism, develop the capacity for regret? Well, how does it help us? Well, it helps us plan for the future. It helps us plan, for example, it helps us plan to save food or to save clothing or fuel or whatever, so that we can get through the winter. It helps us plan and rehearse possibilities without actually having to carry them out. So I can imagine what it would be like if I go through this area of the jungle, or if I go into another tribe's territory. I can rehearse that possibility in my mind without actually risking my life. It helps us develop strategies. So regret is a emotion associated with strategies and alternatives that I might consider. It also helps me learn from past mistakes. So if let's say if I eat spicy food late at night or a heavy meal, and I have indigestion or I can't sleep, it helps me learn from that mistake. And it also reduces impulsive behavior. So regret is kind of a prefrontal cortex thinking apparatus that helps us control our impulsive behavior, because we anticipate, if I act out, if I drink too much, if I engage in inappropriate behavior or whatever, I'm going to regret it. So it helps me reduce that. So this is a way in which regret may have evolved in helping us survive and avoid being the victims of predation. I think that, mistakes have a bad name. We can think about them as outcomes that we learn from. So my view is, don't waste a good mistake. One of the earlier books that I wrote a number of years ago, Overcoming Resistance in Cognitive Therapy, I was motivated by so many mistakes that I made, like ramming down CBT techniques for patients who needed validation and needed time, needed compassion. So, using your mistakes as an opportunity to learn, think about the mistakes that you've made in your relationships. I know I've made mistakes in many relationships and many mistakes as a therapist. So thinking about the mistakes as an opportunity to learn, as the learning curve, as part of growth. And also normalizing everyone makes mistakes, but wisdom is learning from them. Don't make the mistake of not learning from your mistake. And one concept that I find useful and even empowering is what I would call adaptive humility. It's interesting, there's been research on humility that shows that it can be useful. That, for example, in marital relationships, partners who have adaptive humility, which is I'm a human being, I make mistakes, I'm not perfect, I don't deserve any better treatment than anybody else. Those people have better marriages and better friendships, and it makes sense. One thing that I think about is to learn from the mistakes that other people make. So I know that during my youth, I observed that a lot of my friends in college and graduate school were over drinking and using a lot of drugs, and had some very bad outcomes. So I learned that, and these are good people, really smart people. I learned, wow, look at these guys or these women, what they've done. I wonder if I can learn from that. So what I learned is not to misuse alcohol and drugs. It's the least expensive way to use regret. Use the regrets that other people should have had or could have benefited from, anticipating regret. So adaptive humility that I mentioned is, I think, a very empowering, almost paradoxical emotion. Accepting I'm a human being, I'm no better than others. Like even to start the day with thinking, I'm no better than other people, I'm going to make mistakes, I have limitations, but I need to accept who I am while trying to do better. Adaptive humility allows us the opportunity to make mistakes and to learn from them. You can probably see there's some people who make mistakes over and over, but don't learn from them. And that's because they need to justify their mistakes. They need to be smarter and better than other people. They need to be right all the time. That's not going to work. So you can anticipate that my answer to this question is regret ever useful? Is it ever productive? And the answer, it can be. So let's look at that. Let's look at what productive regret would be. It's a feeling of disappointment with a decision I made in the past. Okay, yeah, I made a decision that I regret. But it's accepting that making bad decisions is part of a full life. So it's like, yeah, good decision makers make bad decisions and have bad outcomes. I can accept that. It's the ability to recognize it was a mistake without criticizing myself. Yep, I made a mistake, and I'm not going to criticize myself. I'm going to try to learn from it. To replace rumination with reflection and the ability to learn from my mistake. So I'm not going to sit here and dwell on it for weeks and years and whatever. I'm going to try to learn from the mistake. What would I do differently in the person? And if necessary or if possible, to apologize or to make amends. And to commit to changing my behavior based on what I learned. So you can think about productive regret as part of what I would call, what Carol Dweck calls the growth mindset. I'm going to change my behavior based on what I've learned. I'm going to grow. I'm going to try harder. I'm going to be flexible. And if necessary, to apologize. That's productive regret. So it's a self-regulation strategy. It helps me regulate my behavior. It's an option strategy. It helps me recognize possibilities and consider those and weigh the pros and cons. It's a self-correction and a learning strategy. It can motivate me. You can see I actually misspelled regret, so I need to correct that. I think I'll correct it rather than criticize myself. And it can be productive or unproductive. And we'll talk about the unproductive part, but it can be productive. And I want you to think about, there's some people who seem to have a deficit in regret. And I know you've seen these people. They have impulsive behavior, drinking, acting out, screaming, substance abuse. Oh, I can handle this cocaine. I can handle the opiates. I can handle the alcohol, the binge drinking. Oh, I'm just going to feel good for right now. The failure to self-correct so they don't use regret in a productive way. And of course, people in mania, I've written about manic decision-making, which is where the manic person often thinks they can handle anything. You know, they don't have to anticipate regret because they're so powerful, and they don't need more information. They don't need to weigh the pros and cons. They're super resilient until everything crashes down. So that's where we have the deficit in regret, but then we also have, as you know, excessive regret. And we can have this where people are very, very hesitant to make a change. They anticipate regret before taking action. So if I have social anxiety disorder, I'm not going to go to that party because I might sound like a fool and regret what happens. Avoid taking action because I might fear regretting. So I'm not going to take that course because I might fail because it seems too hard. And we can reflect on regrets about past decisions where we dwell on it over and over and over, and we ruminate about our past mistakes and criticize ourselves. And you can see this is a key thing about depression. So let's look at very briefly how regret plays out in different areas of psychopathology. With depression, looking back on my life and seeing a lot of failures. That's an item from the Beck Depression Inventory. So it's depression, a lot of regret for some, or rumination, just dwelling on my past decisions. You can see that rumination, as we know, leads to depression. Or procrastination, putting off making a decision to do something because I might regret that it'll be unpleasant. So I'm not going to exercise because it might be unpleasant. I'm not going to work on that project because it might be unpleasant, and then things begin to fall apart. Low self-esteem, because as we know from the work on behavioral activation by Chris Martel and others, that one of the ingredients of depression is avoidance and passivity and isolation, which then leads to low self-esteem. And a lot of that is because the person anticipates they'll regret taking action or interacting with people. Or hoarding. Hoarding is all about regret, the fear that I'll regret throwing out that object and that I might need it in the future. So it would be the lost opportunity to have that object in the future. So it's anticipating regret. And social anxiety disorder, if I go into an interaction, I might look incompetent, or do the post-mortem after the party and think about what an idiot I sounded like. Or people with generalized anxiety disorder who worry in the future, I anticipate something bad might happen, and if I don't do something. And avoidance and indecisiveness, all part of anticipating regret. So we can see where regret is a transdiagnostic process that can affect almost any of the major psychopathology, DSM-5, Axis 1. Regret is what I would call the cancel emotion. You cancel out what is in favor of what I could imagine. So I could have pursued a different career, so it cancels out this career. I could have pursued a different relationship. It cancels out this. It cancels out the life that you're living. As I said before, nothing is ever going to be as great as your fantasy. And of course, guilt. Not all regret involves guilt, but guilt can be a major part of regret. And it's what I would call regret on steroids, where you just are overwhelmed with self-incrimination and regret and rumination. However, guilt can also be useful if it leads us to correct our behavior and to apologize and make amends. There's a chapter in the book on guilt, which I don't have time today to go through. So I looked at different styles of decision-making that I think make us prone to regret. So let's kind of briefly review each one. I'm just going to mention them and then go through each of them a little bit more detail. If you're intolerant of ambivalence, you're more prone to anticipating regret or having a regret. Uncertainty, if you're intolerant of uncertainty, more regret. If you have existential perfectionism, like my life has to be wonderful, you have more regret. Emotional perfectionism, these are concepts from my emotional schema model. Emotional perfectionism, like my emotions should be clear and wonderful and understandable and all of that, more regret. If I try to maximize outcomes and get the best decision, best outcome, more regret. If I don't have humility, more regret. If I have a depressive decision-making style, more regret. If I have hindsight bias, more regret. So we'll go through these briefly. To intolerance of ambivalence, could be, could not be. Some people view ambivalence as equated with a bad outcome. Like, if I marry that person, I have mixed feelings, so that means it's not the right person. You hear that quite often. It means I'm not being responsible. I have to be absolutely sure. It's unacceptable. I need more and more information. It's very much tied to intolerance of uncertainty, but it's also distinguishable from it. I must wait to feel ready. This is the readiness illusion. And it's also the illusion of what I call pure mind, that my mind should be completely pure and clear and logical. I should be absolutely sure. So the pure mind is like this black and white, very boring illustration versus the way life really is and the way your brain functions, which is a kaleidoscope and random firings of synapses. But this is what the pure mind can't tolerate ambivalence. So let's keep in mind that ambivalence is part of any decision, because actually the word decision means in Latin to cut away from. Decision means to cut away from, which means that you are feeling one way and you're feeling the opposite way. Responsibility is not the same thing as no ambivalence. It's related to having a more realistic choice. So how many of you who are watching this think that your partner or your friend could have some ambivalent feelings toward you? And how many of you have ambivalent feelings toward your partner or your friend or family members? Probably most of you have ambivalence and are the objects of ambivalence, because life is not absolutely perfect. Now, if you don't accept ambivalence, then you're not going to make a decision. So there's an acceptance piece in here, that even though you can be committed to action in Steve Hayes' model, the reality of it is that even being committed to action means you can make a commitment and carry your ambivalence with you. Making no decision is a decision. So some people think, well, I'm not going to make a decision until I'm sure, but making no decision is a decision. It's a decision not to change. And the decision not to change means that maybe you're going to miss some opportunities. More information is not always relevant. So this is true for intolerance of ambivalence and intolerance of uncertainty. And waiting could involve opportunity costs. If I keep waiting, maybe that person who I wanted to make the commitment to will not be available, or that job will not be available. The same thing with uncertainty. It's equated with a bad outcome. Some people treat uncertainty as the same thing as catastrophe. We know that the work by Dugas and Ladouceur on intolerance of uncertainty illustrates this. We can try to seek certainty by reassurance seeking or getting more information or waiting, but we'll never have absolute certainty. And we can think about what are the costs and benefits of accepting uncertainty. If I can accept uncertainty, then I can make changes, I can make decisions, I can reject alternatives, I can get on with my life. We can think about current examples of uncertainty that we accept. So I can accept the uncertainty that my computer could crash or my PowerPoint could fail or my mind could go blank, but I'm going to accept that uncertainty. I can live with that to get on with doing things. Or one technique that I use for worry and for uncertainty is what I call the boredom technique, which is to flood myself over and over. It's never possible to gain certainty, or it's always possible that could not work out. So flooding yourself with uncertainty until you get bored with that statement can be helpful. Think about which positive outcomes you've experienced where you were uncertain. Have you experienced positive outcomes with uncertainty? Who do you know who has certainty? Nobody. Would certainty be boring? What if every single day was Groundhog Day? Do groundhogs get bored? I don't know. You don't need certainty if you're able to cope with a range of outcomes. And this is where I will illustrate this with what I call relative preferences. So we can have a range of outcomes that I could find acceptable. And then you can carry out behavioral experiments that Dugas and Ladouceur and others have done in their behavioral approach to tolerance of uncertainty, make a prediction about something that's uncertain and carry it out. And even if the outcome turns out to be negative, do you survive? Another thing that gets in the way and contributes to regret is what I call existential perfectionism, that my life should be fulfilling. I should only be doing what I want to do. Everything should be going my way. As one patient said to me once, joking, he said, wouldn't my life be better if everything went exactly the way I wanted to and everybody did what I wanted them to do? That life is not one on this planet. So the existential perfectionist has this ideal life in mind. I'm entitled. I can't tolerate frustration, demandingness, overgeneralized complaints, dissatisfaction. And what Albert Ellis years ago called receding reference points. So I reached this, I need more. I reached this, I need more, and so forth, to the point of disillusionment. So how do we challenge this? One is that there's no perfect or ideal life. Nobody has it. The world was not constructed to make you happy. A lot of people, oh, I should be happy. Why does the world do it? No one's constructing the world for you or anybody. Demanding more will make you feel deprived and more regretful, whereas appreciating more and having more gratitude will help erase regret. Everyone becomes disillusioned about something because we all have illusions. Like some people will say, well, I was disillusioned with this job or this relationship. And that may be because you had an illusion. You had an expectation that it was going to be perfect. And maybe you need to be flexible and change those expectations. Emotional perfectionism is another part that's related to existential perfectionism. And I should be happy all the time. My work should never be boring. I should never be frustrated. Everything should feel good to me. Painful feelings are impossible for me to tolerate. Nobody has this life, this emotional perfectionism. Life has its ups and downs. It's a landscape of highs and lows and plateaus and dead ends. So this idea of emotional perfectionism will make you disappointed and regretful because whatever outcome you achieve in the long term will not give you perfect emotions. So who do you know who's happy all the time? Why don't you surveil your friends? Boredom and frustration are part of life. Demanding that you should feel good will make you miserable. If you go around, oh, I should feel good. Why do I feel sad? Focus on what I call constructive discomfort, which means to do things every day that might be uncomfortable, that will move you forward. So I believe in exercising every day, even if you are uncomfortable, even if you don't want to do it. It's like doing what you don't want to do so you can get what you want to get. Be more proud and feel more effective by overcoming obstacles rather than thinking you should never have obstacles. Another part of regret is the maximizer illusion. So Herbert Simon, who got the Nobel Prize in economics, a psychologist at Carnegie Mellon years ago, made this distinction between maximizers, I want the very best, 100%, versus the satisfier, I'm willing to accept a range of outcomes of good enough. So the maximizer takes longer to make decisions, and they're less satisfied with the outcome. And ironically, even though they might objectively get a better outcome, they're still less satisfied, because what they do is they compare the better outcome to the best that they can imagine. So maximizers, they take longer. If I get more information, look at all the options, I'm going to get the best outcome, and then I will be satisfied. So it actually backfires. So let's look at the challenges. I should always go for the best. What are the costs and benefits of demanding the best? Well, this leads to less satisfaction, more regret, and more indecision. This is what we know from reality, from the research. If I don't have the best, then I'm mediocre. I've heard this from a lot of clients in the past. Consider having healthy high standards. This is what you might call adaptive perfectionism. Healthy high standards, well, maybe I'll aim for 85% rather than aiming for 100%. People will think less of me if I settle for less. Which people, and how do you know that's true? And maybe a lot of your friends have settled for less than perfect. Would real friends, people who really care for you, not want you to be content? Contentment is for failures. There's a lot of pushback on contentment. What I found in my experience as a clinician in my life, very few people complain about being content. We have an aspirational acquisition culture. It's been around for over 100 years. There was a British economist who wrote a book called The Aspirational Society back in the 1920s. But that's what we have today in 2023. If I don't aim for the best, I'll lose my motivation. I have to have my edge. But it also can make you burned out and feel disappointed and dissatisfied and lose balance in life. I can never be satisfied with less than the best. Think about how much easier your life would be if you were satisfied. We can also compare yourself to the, rather than the top 1%, to the bottom 10%. We can think if everything were taken away, you had nothing, what would you want back first? So I've done this exercise with people. What they want back first is their children, their partner, their eyesight, their ability to think and feel. Imagine contentment. What moment in your life did you feel really content? Practice gratitude. Imagine relative preferences as satisfactory. So yeah, if I don't get the best, I can accept 85%, 75%. If I'm flexible, I can accept a lot more. I can be flexible and get through my life. And you can think about contrasting preferences with the idea of needs, demands, or imperatives. Like I must have that, or I must have the best, or my partner should be the best, or I should be happy all the time. Versus, if I'm happy 70% of the time, that's pretty good. So relative preferences is something that I think we all experience. You go to a buffet, they don't have your favorite dish. Is there anything else there? Imagine how your life would be better if you had relative preferences. And we can challenge essentialism by relative preferences, how much better your life would be if you were to accept and appreciate what you have. No matter what you get, you eventually get used to it anyway. I'd like to think about the life portfolio. So if you think that something's essential, think about, well, I have a lot of other things in my life, relationships, work, family. My life portfolio is many things. I'm not defined by one thing. But what is your life portfolio? Expand that, expand the sources of meaning in your life and seek those out on a daily basis. Adaptive humility is something that I've mentioned before, that I'm only human. I can recognize in some ways I'm more fortunate than others. If you're living in North America, you're probably better off than 95% of people in the world. I can say yes to what I have and who I am and have contentment. Just imagine if we waved a magic wand and over your head and you suddenly became content with what you had. What stress would be reduced? What regret would be reduced? What gratitude would be opened up? What appreciation would be opened up? Let's take a closer look at decision-making and regret. And people who are depressed perceive they have low confidence. They view further losses as devastating. They think they have few resources. They think they can't persist in a course of action. They don't have much pleasure in gains because they have anhedonia. They think there's a high cost for negative outcomes, negativity, self-criticism. They suffer their losses more than they enjoy their gains. They bet against themselves. So manic people play to win at all costs. Depressed people play to avoid losing at all costs. So we can challenge this. They exaggerate the magnitude of the outcome. Maybe, just find out, is the outcome actually worse, as bad as you think it is? We can diversify the sources of rewards in your life. We can also think that it takes a while for pleasure to kick in. You have to keep at the rewarding behavior for the pleasure to kick in. Set short-term and long-term goals for rewarding. Develop a diverse source of rewards in your life, not just bet on one thing to overcome your sense of helplessness. Many people who are depressed demand immediate rewards. I have to get it right now, immediately. Rather than extend your time horizon. Give yourself more time to get rewards, more time to build up. If you want to get into shape, it's going to take you a while, going to the gym for months. Don't give up too early, persist, replicate your behavior, keep going out, keep engaging in behavior. Don't view one outcome as essential. Think about outcomes as a relative preferences or a range of outcomes or a range of behaviors. Examine the evidence of your competence. What would your friends say to you or your desirability? So many of our depressed clients think they have nothing going for them. We won't be able to go through all these. It may take a while for the pleasure to kick in. Also think about your anti-pleasure thoughts. This is not as pleasant as I wanted, or I don't have someone I want, so it doesn't count. A lot of discounting about pleasure. Think about engaging in potentially rewarding behaviors until the pleasure and the reward is felt. And reduce the exaggerated negativity, the catastrophic viewing about outcomes. So hindsight bias, briefly, I should have known that. Patient described her ex-husband as, she should have known that he was going to be an alcoholic and be verbally abusive. But when she married him, he was dating him. He was the nicest guy in the world, and he was not an alcoholic. So who isn't good at predicting yesterday? What's the difference? Hindsight bias is, I should have known that stuff that happened yesterday or last week or last year. We think we should know things in the past. What's the difference between knowing now and knowing then? Knowing now, I have the outcome. I have more information. What's the information I had when I was making my decision? Should I be responsible for knowing what I did not know? How complicated and noisy was the information that I had? And a lot of information, and a lot of it is noise. We can also think about being flexible about expectations. What would be the benefit of being flexible, or matching my expectations to reality? So one person said, I thought my wife was going to retire when we got married, person in a second marriage, and she decided to delay retirement. I said, why not change your expectations to match reality, and then appreciate all the other things that are good? Replace your expectation with relative preference. Or ask yourself, are expectations part of entitlement? And if so, why are you entitled? So thinking about self-criticism can be replaced with self-correction. I can learn from that mistake. I can view outcomes as learning experiences, as experiments that I carry out. I can think that good decision makers also make bad decisions. George Soros lost $1 billion in 1 or 2 years after Trump was elected. Evaluate decision-making in terms of following a rational process, not by the outcome. Don't think if you go to Las Vegas and put down your life savings and you win, that you made a good decision. You made a crazy decision, but you were just lucky. So rumination, we can think about these intrusive thoughts, not as I get latched on to them and hijacked by them. We can think about them as trains in the station. These thoughts are trains that come into the station. I don't get on the trains. Or clouds in the sky, I see them passing by. Or a balloon, the thought balloon that it goes up in the air and I let it go. Or a telemarketing call that I don't answer. So we can use a lot of metacognitive techniques that Adrian Wells and others have suggested. So decisions are always made under uncertainty. It's always risk versus risk. No decision is a decision. And I think I'm going to end there and maybe open it up to some questions if you have questions.
Thank you so much. And everyone, feel free to submit questions at any time. But I would just kind of like to kick it off where obviously regret is a universal experience, whether or not one is diagnosed. But do you see an increase in the prevalence or the severity of regret if someone is diagnosed with anxiety or depression?
I think there are a couple of things. I think that anxiety is often about anticipating regret, and depression is about reflecting on regret. We've seen a significant increase of anxiety and depression, not only since the pandemic, but in the last 10 or 20 years. I think part of that, a lot of our regret is obviously is focused on expectations, which have really accelerated with social media. Gene Twang and others have looked at the expectations and the rise of narcissistic entitlement about the way our lives should be. And that's really fed by social media, which I think feeds regret.
That's interesting. You mentioned the difference between kind of cultural impacts on regret, like the interpersonal versus the group. Is there a generational change as well?
I don't think anybody has studied. It's an excellent question. It's an excellent question. Is there a generational change in regret? I don't know of any, let's say, generational cohort studies, looking at the kinds of regret. It would be hard for me to imagine that somebody living in the United States in 1943 in the middle of World War II would be regretful that they didn't have the ideal life. What they would be appreciative of is that a family member is alive.
Right. That makes sense. We had a question came in that what would you say to a patient who is ruminating in regret about how they treated someone poorly who is now deceased, so they can't go and resolve that through like apologizing to them?
Well, that's, I think, a very, very common experience. And one way of dealing with that would be to write out an apology, even though you don't send it. If you can sincerely express compassion and loving kindness. Use maybe the meditation that Buddhism recommends for the person who you think you might have hurt, to make amends in your mind and in your heart.
Good advice. I think that is helpful for everyone. Are there some personality disorders that are more prone to regret?
Um, I think that people who are OCD and people who are narcissistic, or people who combine the two, who one of our trainees years ago described as narcessionals, combination of narcissism and compulsive personality, often have a fantasy of a perfect life, an ideal romance, and everything going my way. So it's something that might be the case. But people have avoidant personality, which is really overgeneralized social anxiety disorder. Those people anticipate a lot more regret because they think they're going to be rejected and look like an idiot.
Yeah. And while we have questions coming in, we are a little bit over time, so I'll take one more and then we'll say thank you.
Okay.
We did discuss kind of the regret in terms of relationships. What would you say to a patient who regrets marrying the wrong person?
Well, it's hard to know what the wrong person is until you try to make the relationship better than it is. But let's say you've tried all you can to make it better than it is. You really have a couple of options, and one is to separate, which might be very difficult and have its trade-offs, or to try to build a self-caring life within the confines or limitations of the marriage, so that you have a support network and you have meaningful things that you do. But a lot of people are in marriages that they feel are not optimal. Having said that, I think there's often an exaggerated sense of what a good marriage is. Years ago, I used to do a lot of windsurfing, and I had a patient who divorced who said, what's the key to a good long-term relationship? And I said, it's like somebody who was instructing me in windsurfing in heavy waves and heavy wind. This guy, Mike, the windsurf instructor, said, heavy winds and heavy waves, it's rock and roll and commit to the action. So rock and roll with the waves and commit to the action by pulling that sail as far as you can. Lean back.
That
I
Winsor
hope this is fun.
has lots of life experience, I think. Thank you so much for being here with us today, and thank you to our audience. There are questions that we weren't able to get to, but we do invite you to send them in, and hopefully we can get them answered. To anyone who is not yet an ADAA member, we invite you to join so you could attend webinars such as these for complimentary and get your CEs. We also invite you to the upcoming ADAA conference starting April 13th. So we are less than a month away now.
And also feel free to send me an email if you have any questions. I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you so much.
Take care.